How to be an artist. Step 33. Why cities need artists. With guest Chuck Marone. All right, Chuck Marone, welcome to How to Be an Artist. Really happy to have you here today.
Hey, thanks. Very nice to be here. COVID has given this opportunity for people to chat in ways that they haven't before, and so Brandon, I'm excited to talk to you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's been good in that way. So I just want to kind of give you my strong towns story, kind of how I got into strong towns. So I've been following strong towns for a while. I mean, it's definitely one of the things I used to read it more regularly than any other news source, really, because once kind of this things clicked where I'm like, oh, this is like different, this is interesting, a new way of looking at things. But I really kind of the really big moment for me is you had an article you wrote on the heels of the 2016 election, and I've tried to like dig it up and I can't find it on the Strong Towns website. So maybe you can help me find that one. But the gist of it was kind of like I was like a big Bernie supporter and kind of really disappointed with how the election went. And something about the article was kind of just like, maybe there's more important things to focus on than like who wins the presidential election.
Yeah,
Not that that's not important, but that, there's this big gap between me as an individual in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the federal government, and like what's filling that gap. Like, ought I to be paying attention to that gap and thinking about how to fill it in meaningful ways myself. So that was kind of a big like awakening for me, where I kind of like turned my attention and was like, okay, like let's look at what's happening. I mean, really pretty radically. Like, I know you talk a lot about strong towns and communities, but for me, it was also like personally like focusing on my own life. So that was really cool. But the other thing that's really nice is that you have a Strong Towns book now. So that makes things a lot more helpful for me as I'm trying to like explain to people. Because a lot of times when I'm trying to introduce like ideas of urbanism to other people, I'm like, yeah, you should read Suburban Nation, read like Walkable Cities, and then I'd be like, and go check out Strong Towns, and I have to put links and stuff. But now I can just be like, hey, get this book.
yeah.
Just like, and the book is like a really wonderful distillation of all of the most important concepts on strong towns. And so I thought it was just fantastic. It was so cool to be able to finally get my hands on it and see how you tied all of those ideas together. And I just want to read, I love the quote from Andres Duani on this.
Yeah.
Um,
It blew my mind too. When he sent that to me, I'm like, this is so generous. So
I,
yeah.
it's great. I mean, it's really, anyway, sometimes in our depleted and cynical times, one hears, well, then what is your genius plan? Here it is finally, with extraordinary force and clarity, a genius plan. So good job on putting together a genius plan. It's,
Thank you.
but for me, I feel like you and working with Strong Towns have really done this really important job of creating this clear picture of kind of the fragility that's existing kind of in how we are building our cities. But then, yeah, the fact that you are taking the second step of saying like, well, let's actually do something about it and talking about like practical ways to start addressing it. So that's been very, very motivating and encouraging for me. And it's really wrapped up a lot of when I think about my ambitions or aspirations as an artist. It's now very much a part of that vision. It isn't so much about like just making artifacts, but like you know thinking about community in place as like an artistic expression. So anyway, that's kind of just thought I should give that introduction first.
Well,
Um,
let me riff off that a little bit because
okay, go ahead.
I think you have a very similar like thought trajectory that I did. I mean, in 2008, I was an angry man. you know, I had run this planning and engineering firm and was doing work for cities that I thought was important and had been trying to help them kind of change the way they were building and developing to be stronger and to be, I didn't have like the language then that I've developed since. But then we hit the housing crisis, and the housing crisis was like the system destroying my business, destroying my relationships with these cities. all these cities that I was working for financially were imploding. And the first thing they did was lay off the consultant, especially the pain in the neck consultant that's been telling them that they need to change what they're doing. And so all of a sudden I found myself with a huge amount of debt, no, very little work, employees I had to lay off, a business in shambles. And, I was just mad. I was just angry. And it was one of these things where I think that could manifest in, okay, I'm going to get involved and, become a Twitter warrior for the latest national cause or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, what I did is I tried to understand my life. I tried to understand what was going on. I tried to understand why things weren't working in my community. Because we had all the growth and all the jobs and all the things that my profession and my practice as an engineer and as a planner was saying we need to do. But my city was a shambles. It was a mess. We were cutting millions of dollars out of our budget. We were having like emergency flaming meetings because of, everything was going bad. It was like, how is this possible? How is this even like an option on the table? And yeah, it was this, I think turning that, you mentioned you voted for Bernie, and I feel like the Bernie people that I know generally are dissatisfied with the system, right? Like a vote for Bernie is kind of almost like a vote like this thing needs to radically change. And I felt that way in 2008. I feel that way today. But in 2008, it was anger. And what the Strong Towns process allowed me to do, or what starting to write this blog that became the organization that became what we're doing today, is say, okay, what can I actually affect? What will affecting that actually mean in terms of my life, what I need to do? And then what are the ripple effects of that? So, for me, one of the ripple effects of that is I'm talking to you. I never would have talked to you unless I had dealt with like the thing in front of me and tried to like build momentum up from that. So yeah, I do think that sometimes we, particularly in the art, I think people who have an artistic mindset, you deal with these like large existential problems and you're like, that have kind of angst over the general direction of society. But the reality is there's a lot of love and joy and happiness, along with a lot of pain and suffering, but a lot that we can do to create love with the people right around us and the neighborhoods we live in and the stuff we can touch and feel and make better. And doing that is not a bad place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it feels like increasingly that's the only place to start, you know?
Yeah.
And you talk about empowering, which people say like, oh, this is or that is empowering, which becomes such a trite thing. But just the idea that I can do something with my own hands and my own relationships. But also, it's just that's the reality. I think that was the other thing I think I got from that article is it's not just how relevant is the presidency to me, but like how much of an effect do I really have on federal politics? And I can like scream about it every day on Twitter, but like what are the things that I actually have power of and actually have control over? And how much that can be neglected when you're so focused outward,
Right.
right?
Well, by 2016, and let me say this, and I say this with humility. By 2016, I had been invited to the White House a couple of times. I had, for a guy in a small town from Minnesota, the idea that you could go testify at, Congress, that you could go get invited to the White House, that you could go and give presentations to the major federal bureaucracies, that I had done that. And you know what? It took a lot of time and a lot of energy and it didn't make any dent in anything. But when I work on like making the park a little bit nicer with my neighbors, it changed everything. Like it changes the entire momentum of the community. It affects, it affects this, it has this massive, disproportionate positive impact.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I for my own life, this morning, I got a email from a Senate staffer with a question, what are you, and I'll tell you what, it's not that I don't care, but that's a lower priority email to me than
Yeah.
my neighbor saying, "Hey, could you come over and help with this?" Uh, you know,
Yeah.
because taking the 5 minutes or 10 minutes to respond to the Senate staffer will not change the needle at all in any way. But building momentum in my own community is really going to have ripple effects in lots of places.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. That gets me excited just hearing that. Yeah. I think I probably should, before we go any further, I don't know if it would be worthwhile for you to maybe just give like a some sort of brief overview, which is, I think, is you know, gonna sell Strongtown short, however brief you get. I mean, anything that can help people end up reading the book is probably the best thing. But just as an introduction to, the listeners of this podcast, so they can get an idea of what you're about.
Yeah. Well, I'm an engineer and I'm a planner, and I work for cities for many, many years doing that kind of work, building streets, developments, uh, putting in strip malls, sewer, water. I did an airport project once, that kind of thing. In the mid 2000s, I started to become obsessed with answering the question, why are our cities experiencing such financial distress? I was working because I was a consultant. I basically, my firm, and I had 13 staff at one point, we were working for cities that were fast growing. So if you had a big developer come in or a project come in, or you were experiencing a lot of growth and were kind of overwhelmed, you would call in the professionals and we would come in and we would help you, deal with this. So I was kind of on the front lines of all this. And the common thing that I saw over and over again was the faster you grew, the poorer you became.
Hmm.
The more you did this stuff, the more desperate your budget situation got. Taxes would go up, debt would go up, kind of the fiscal constraints would grow. And I started to do the math. I started to kind of ask some basic questions about different development patterns, trying to get to this answer of why are cities struggling financially. And what I started to recognize was that the pattern of development, the actual way we go about building things, is not only a radical shift from the way cities have been built for thousands of years, um, but it generates a lot of growth very quickly, a lot of upfront cash, so to speak, from a city balance sheet. But it generates these long-term liabilities. Let me just give you like a prime, easy example of this. If a developer comes in and builds a new subdivision and puts in 20 homes, and they build the road and the pipe and all this stuff, the city's cost for that up front is zero. The developer paid for that. They put it in the sale price of the homes. The people who bought the homes are paying for that in their mortgages. The upfront price of the community as a whole is zero. But the benefit immediately is really great. The city gets all this permitting revenue. They get the property tax. They get new people in. So that there's sales tax, there's new people in the community buying stuff. From a cash flow standpoint, it's really positive. So the more you grow, the more cash you're going to have on hand. The problem is, as part of this, the city agrees that they'll fix that road when it falls apart, that they'll fix that pipe when it goes bad, that they'll provide police protection out there, that they'll, do all this stuff. And when you start to add up those costs, what you see is that you might get a dime today, but in order to get that dime today, you obligate your city to spend $1 tomorrow. And you do that enough times and you're going to be insolvent. You're going to go broke. You're going to have these huge constraints. And so I started writing about this. And of course, once you go down this rabbit hole, as you kind of intimated, there are a whole bunch of different things that come into play. The way we design our cities, the way we lay them out, the permitting processes, zoning, the way we finance, the way we use capital markets, the way we relate to each other in a place. All these things are tied into what is essentially our human habitat,
Yeah.
the habitat that we live in. And what I came to recognize kind of more than anything else is that if we look at cities of the past, they really were that human habitat. They were imperfect things for imperfect species, us. But they did, in many ways, kind of optimize our living experience. They optimized our cultural interactions. They optimized our financial wherewithal. They optimized our, our public health. There were a lot of different things that were not perfect, and certainly no one would say utopia, but that cities, as our habitat, kind of co-evolved with us, handled. And then we said, you know what? That's kind of messy. We don't really like it. We need to grow faster. We need all these things. Let's come up with a brand new approach. And we really, in a radical way, instituted a new experiment on ourselves in how humans should live. People think this is the automobile, and it really is way more than just the automobile. It's how we lay out our homes, how they interact with each other, how we get to our daily needs. All this stuff is a radical new experiment. And it's had dramatic impacts, not only on our balance sheet, but on our health and wellness, on how we relate to each other, on, I think the discourse in our society, all these things interact with our human habitat. I say in the book, we understand and we can look at a beehive and we can recognize that bees and beehives co-evolve together.
Yeah.
The bees create the hive and the hive shape the bees, and the two work together. And we understand that like beehives are in a sense designed and engineered to make the bees fully what they are, right? It brings out their beeness, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I think when we look at cities, it's tough for us sometimes to recognize that that is human habitat co-evolved with us, designed to kind of bring out our humanity in ways that we're not even, I think, fully aware of all the time. And if you went into a beehive and said, you know what, this is kind of messy, it's kind of nasty, let's put the bee living quarters over here, and we'll make a bee cul-de-sac over here, and we'll put the honey in a strip mall thing over here, and we'll like change this all around, that you would wind up with very neurotic, dysfunctional, bees. Like that wouldn't work. But in human habitat, somehow we've, accepted that this is normal, and it's very much not. So that's what we're trying to explain, like all the different dimensions of that radical experiment that we're doing on ourselves.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to kind of sum it up. I love that you use the analogy of the beehive, because that's one I've been thinking about a lot lately. I really like there's a quote from Jonathan Haidt where he says, human beings are 90% chimpanzee, 10% bee, and I think that may be actually a little bit of a low percentage. That
Yeah.
there's this quality where humans and human societies are these kind of super organisms where, as a whole, we function as an organism, and we really forget that our settlements, the places we live, our town and our cities, are part of that anatomy of this organism of being human beings. And if that thing is sick, if that thing is not built correctly or balanced, it makes the parts in it sick. It limits the potential of the things within it. So yeah, that's a really great way to phrase it.
Well, Jared Diamond wrote a book called The Fourth Chimpanzee, which looks at the human, basically like the human evolutionary tree, and how closely we are related to chimpanzees. And of course, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman's book, I've described that. If you ever get a chance to read that, it's one of the greatest books I think ever written. It's just
Okay.
deeply insightful. But to me, the summary, like the tweet summary, is as a human, you are just a slightly evolved chimpanzee. Like all these things in our brains just function automatically. And then we, in a sense, explain them away as if they're rational, but they really are just innate things that we as slightly evolved chimpanzees do on a regular basis, including a lot of our social function and a lot of our cognitive decision making is comes from this. It's a fascinating book about the human brain, really.
Yeah, I've been meaning to pick that one up. I should probably check that one out. How does
Yeah.
it how does it compare to, how do you rank it next to something like Anti-Fragile then?
Well, the whole inserto, the Nassim Taleb writings to me are like essential. They're
Yeah.
bedrock. If you want to understand strong towns, that's the place to start. But Thinking Fast and Slow is on I have a list of like required reading for
Okay.
strong towns. Like if you want to really understand strong towns, here's like the 10 books to read. And Thinking Fast and Slow is one of those 10.
Oh, awesome. Okay, that's one I still
Yeah.
need to. I've done my due
Yeah.
diligence with Nassim Taleb, but I'll check that one
Yeah.
out too.
Nassim Taleb is one of those where you read, all of these really are, you read and then you take a long walk, and then you read and then you take a long walk. And so the book will take you longer than a normal book because it has to be done with long walks to actually think through what this means.
Yeah, that I can see how that's the case because I first read Taleb like quite a long time ago. I read Non-Random and I think The Bed of Procrustes, where I was like,
Yep.
okay, those are interesting.
The aphorisms and yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't until Anti-Fragile, and even read Anti-Fragile, and then I think it was really through Strong Towns that I kind of revisited it, and that's when I was kind of like, okay, this is the most important thing that's been written in a
It's
long, long
funny.
time.
It's funny because he writes in a way intentionally to be a little bit not approachable. It's very readable, but it's not very easily summarized or categorized. And he does that on purpose because he wants you to have to deal with and struggle with the ideas intentionally, right?
Mm.
Not passively. It's not a really good book on tape, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But it is a good book to read a section or two and then go for a walk and think about it, or find someone to talk to about it. It kind of breaks down that way. And I go back to them all the time because I find his writing to be very inspiring.
yeah. I find myself doing that quite a bit, where there's some concept, and I'm like, I can fit it into like some sort of Anti-Fragile way of looking at things.
Well,
Like,
there's very few people in this world, and this is a sad statement, maybe on me, but maybe on the world too. There's very few people in the world where when they say something that I reflexively disagree with, I will pause and say, okay, what do I have wrong? you know, like they'll say,
even,
should this be this way or this way? And I'll be like, well, obviously it's A. And Nassim
yeah,
Taleb will say, well, obviously it's B. And I'm like, whoa, wait a sec. What have I, because a lot of times I think our natural instinct is, I know what I'm doing. You're an idiot. If you say B, you're wrong. And Nassim Taleb is one of these people, we all have our people like that. But Nassim is mine, where it's like, if he says something that's counterintuitive to me, I'm like, okay, what? I don't necessarily always agree with him, but I'm like, what am I not understanding about this
sure.
that leads this like deep thinker to a radically different point of view?
Does that include like looking at his interpersonal style? Are you like, do I need to be more of an
No,
asshole to people on Twitter?
no, I had to reconcile with that a while back. Here's kind of what because you're in Utah, right?
Yeah,
Um, when I've visited Utah, I've felt myself very much at home as a Minnesotan. I found it a very like I get the culture there. I get it. It's
there's
very
similar cultures. Yeah,
yes, it's very similar
Midwesterners.
culture.
Yeah,
I one time I took this quiz on like where should you live, and
yeah,
the number one was Provo, the number two was Salt Lake City, and the number three was some other city in Utah. And I'm like, okay,
yeah,
but when I go to the Northeast and I give a talk or a series of talks, I'm like, who are these? These are just like, who are these people? Like, I don't get them. They're aggressive, and they're not. They're really nice people, but they're not Minnesotans. And
yeah,
we just deal with things a little bit differently. So I've kind of just put Taleb in a Lebanese culture kind of box and just
yeah.
accepted that this is his culture and this is the way he communicates. And it's abrasive for a Minnesotan, but if I want to interact with his world, I kind of have to accept his culture a little bit, you
I,
know?
I've sometimes described you to some of my friends as like a translator for Nassim Taleb, as far as like, I'm going to say the same thing, but without like cursing at you.
Without being a dick. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a huge compliment.
But that kind of brings me to I've been really interested in just kind of like the whole like rhetorical style of strong towns. Um, I think obviously I really like the ideas, but as I have read more and more, I just like the way that you kind of package ideas. I guess the way that I kind of think about it is it's almost like you're running a compression. There's these complex ideas you're pulling together. You're kind of running this compression on them to try to create a package in a certain way that people can easily kind of like understand or at least become interested in, and then they can start unpacking it themselves and like, oh, okay, see all the nuances in it. And I love all the phrases, terms that have been coined. You were talking earlier about like, this experiment, the whole idea of the suburban experiment, this big experiment we've done, and it's just this really simple way of kind of getting you to kind of see, put it in perspective, how we live compared to kind of this like traditional way of living. Things like Strode's suburban Ponzi scheme, incremental development. Was that one from Strong Towns as well?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's great. So I'd be interested in like, yeah, how do you think rhetorically about ideas and how you present ideas?
So yesterday was my father's 70th birthday.
Uh huh.
And I think it's important to know that he is my target audience. People ask me like, who's Strongtown's target audience? And I'm like, well, I don't know, but for my writing, it's my dad. And so, we all have our parent experience, right? But my dad is one of these guys who very strong opinions, uh, very cynical about his son's opinions, you know. Um, one of these guys with like he ended up being an elementary school teacher, but he came from a very blue collar. He worked at the paper mill for a while. He got injured there, couldn't go back, wound up becoming a teacher, and was a great elementary school teacher because he was a guy who got C's and D's in school, right? So he could relate to the kids that struggled, and he had patience for them and all that. But it wasn't a patience of like deep knowledge. It was a patience of, you can do this. Like, I was dumber than you, and I made my way through this. So it's kind of like a BS meter he has. And if you go in and you talk to him like, here's what induced demand is, and don't be an idiot, you should get this. He's like, yeah, that's a bunch of BS. You can do anything with math, Chuck. You can just don't. So I always feel like if I'm going to communicate something that challenges his base core assumptions about the world, which, he starts with the world as he sees, and this is the way it is. And if I'm going to challenge something on that, I have to start where he is, with something that he resonates with. And he is going to say, yeah, I'm with you. I agree. Like, that's a good starting spot. And then I have to find a way to weave him to a different place. And I have to do it without using jargon, buzzwords. I have to do it without tripping his political sensibilities, which quite frankly are all over the map. I mean, he is a ultra conservative who has never voted for a Republican. He is like, hates Donald Trump, but also hates the Clintons. He's such this like weird person, with very like kind of almost like chimpanzee like reactions emotionally to different things, but yet very thoughtful and intelligent, and you can have a conversation with him. And so I find that I just developed this skill in talking to him over the years, where you have to start where he is. You have to weave him through to where you want to go. And the things that you can never treat him, and you shouldn't, but you can never treat him like a dummy, like he doesn't know something. You have to, a lot of people say you have to dumb things down. You can't dumb things down. You have to give it to him honestly and fully, but in a way that is approachable and reachable. And I think the discipline of explaining things to him, and I love the guy. I mean, he's amazing. The discipline of explaining things to him has just happened to translate really well to explaining things to like this broad society of people. I feel like if you could talk to my dad and have him go, yeah, okay, I'm with you there. Like, I get that. Then you can reach 95% of people.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, one of the things that I also really quickly picked up about strong towns that appealed to me is that when I started getting interested in urbanism, a lot of the resources out there are they're really made for people that are professionals, planners, architects, things like that. And there's just, the voice is kind of that voice. And I like that strong towns is both, and sometimes there is like a political orientation. That's very, very common with
Let me
urbanism
say
stuff,
it,
right?
because I think you're being kind. Uh, the world of urbanism is dominated by white male progressives. That's who and
Yeah.
they have a certain like liberal elitist type of speech and cadence that they use in their conversations that is very off-putting for most of America. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a shame. And I think finding more diverse voices has meant for our organization finding people who are not white. That's been a big deal. I think a lot of female writers at Strong Towns and female voices have been very important for us. Um, but also the non-liberal framing of things is, we're not like some right-wing group, but we often get accused by a lot of urbanists of being like flaming right-wingers. And it's only because we don't use like the comforting liberal buzzwords and like starting points for everything.
Yeah.
Because again, I'm talking to my dad. If I talk to my dad about Latinx and BIPOCs and safe urban spaces, he his eyes just glaze over. He's like, that's all stupid stuff, Chuck. Talk to me
Yeah.
like a human.
And it's that there are certain like words and phrases that are they're signals, right? They're signals to tell people I'm one of you, and they don't
Yes.
really actually play any purpose in like what you're trying to talk about. But it's just saying like, hey, I'm safe, I'm on your side. And one of the things I really admire about Strong Towns is how you guys have even said this explicitly that you're just like really determined to not be partisan in any way. And it shows in every way that you guys do things and talk about things. And you talk about issues that, the right and left cares about, but you're very disciplined about talking about them in the way that is not trying to like say, we're on this side, we're part of this team. So I
Right.
really appreciate that too.
It is fascinating because we've done surveys of our audience and we've asked, many different questions, but one of them was on like political affiliation. And it is fascinating that the political affiliation of our audience mirrors the political affiliation of the US. It's
Awesome.
like 40% identify as left of center, 35% identify as right of center. There's a bunch of people identify as non-aligned. And that is a source of pride for us because I want people to be able to come here and engage on issues that are in the realm of public policy and politics, but do it free from you do it with their political orientation. Like I'm not trying to deprogram you. If you are a progressive, if you are a conservative, we're not trying to deprogram you. But what we're trying to do is overlay an understanding about places in your political framework that is going to kind of be common knowledge across all, political spectrums. That's what we're trying to do. And that does take if you go read my early writing, I was not anywhere near as good at that as I
Mm.
as we are as an organization today, because we're very disciplined. I would say the thing we have the most internal meetings on is questioning different usage of words and phrasings and whether this or that kind of way of talking about something will be inviting or alienating to audiences. And we have a blanket um, invitation from everyone on the team internally. If something doesn't sound, if something like, I'm going to use the word trigger, that's not the word we use internally, but it's just, if something like rubs you the wrong way or you're have like a knee jerk reaction to it, step up and say something. We are going to talk about it in the most respectful way. That's the one thing I insist is like no one internally ever flames anybody or questions anybody's motives. We're going to be generous to everybody internally and we're going to talk about it and we're going to ask, is there a better way that we could do this? And out of that internal process has evolved this communication style that I think, yeah, you accurately describe. If someone comes to our site, the critique we have is that from politics is that you're not signaling to me that you're on my team, but you're also not signaling that you're on the other team. And
Yeah.
so for people who are hyper partisan, it's kind of like a demilitarized zone where they're
Mhm.
like waiting for someone to start opening fire or like hit a tripwire with a bomb or something. But once they get comfortable in that space, then I think
Yeah.
they get used to it.
That's nice. Yeah, it's kind of made me reflect that as I've done work like locally within my own neighborhood, um, on local issues, one thing that you start to find, there are definitely people that have different politics, but a lot of like local issues just they kind of fall outside of these boundaries that you've normally in your mind you're like, if you're on the left, you're like, regulation is good, uh, too much market is bad. But once you start working like on the local level, you're like, okay, wait a second. Like, actually, maybe regulations are, we have a little bit too much zoning. Maybe there's a little bit too restrictive, and that's keeping people from doing some of the things we want to have happening. And a lot of those categories start to break down as soon as you are working on some sort of practical problem. And I think that almost kind of like demonstrates how impractical a lot of kind of the large scale politics are, or the fact that like we do get divided because we're completely just like operating in this abstract world. We're not interfacing
Right.
with like the real world.
Well, let
Um,
me let me slightly not contradict you, but push back just a little bit. I can tell you from in the 1990s and early 2000s, I went to tons and tons of city council meetings. I mean, I think for a decade there was nobody who went to more public meetings than I did, because it was like every night of the week, sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a night. I would just go from one to the other to the other. Um, Over time, and I would say it started to happen in the mid 2000s, but certainly by 2010, it was everywhere. Uh, Local city council members were taking talking points from Fox News and MSNBC and bringing them into the council discussions.
hmm,
They would talk about, we would come up with a variance to build a shed on a lot. And you'd have one council member go, well, you know, uh, how dare the government regulate and tell your property? And I'm like, we do zoning. Like, we've done zoning for 4 decades. Like, and then you'd have someone else step in and say, we can't give a variance to someone. We have to, and then they would have some like insane, like
hmm,
rationale. And you would try to like take the temperature down in the room and get it focused on all of us working together. I feel like that's only grown and it's only
hmm.
gotten worse. And so one of the
Yeah.
things we tell Strong Towns members, like people who are out doing stuff, is part of your job, as hard as it is going to be to take yourself out of the national politics and really invest in your place. And when someone says, and this is really, really hard to do, I'm not saying it isn't, but when someone says something that from your national political perspective is ignorant, cruel, out of touch, elitist, whatever adjective you want to subscribe to it, you have to like get beyond that and find their humanity and try to deal with them as a human, because you'll never solve problems if you're dealing with abortion and race relations and like name your issue. If that is brought into like your street project, you'll never solve it. And so you have to deal with people as humans. And then when you do that, you can actually start to work on those other things if you want to. But at the very least, you can make your place work better for both of you, for everybody.
Yeah, no, that's what you say. That's definitely true. I've noticed that in my own like neighborhood council meetings and such. But the way it functions is when those national politics do kind of infect that process, it really just shuts things down, right? As kind of
Right.
the example you've mentioned kind of demonstrates. But once people really get like committed to actual making change, you see them kind of like being able to set that aside.
Yeah.
Um,
In ways
but
that are beautiful. It's been really sad the last year because now we have the scarlet letter that says what team you're on, if you're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. Now we don't even have to wait for you to speak. We just know what team you're on. And so I would actually go to council meetings like here, and you'd have one half the room would have masks on and the other half the room would not have masks on.
jeez.
And it's like, well, okay, we've just like, this is a toxic environment to have any conversation. I mean, we're gonna have a conversation about the dog catcher. There's team mask and team not mask. And it's like, oh gosh, please stop doing this. Please.
So this is something I think this kind of brings me to something else I kind of wanted to ask you about, and that is kind of the idea of um, there's this concept with housing of like missing middle housing, right? That we have single family homes and we have big apartments, and we don't have all the traditional stuff that used to be in between. And this is similar, but but there's this kind of sense that our politics, there's kind of like a missing middle politics, right? That it's like there's us living our individual lives, and then we have like maybe a city council representative that we're going to try to like influence some way to do what we want. But there's this big gap even between those two things. I mean, let alone like the gap between us and the federal government. But there's kind of even within our own cities and towns, there's this gap where we're really not like we don't have very much of a voice within that area. And one of the things that I think is interesting about strong towns, and this gets back to like this bowling alone idea, right? Like rebuilding like civic engagement. That it's not enough for us just to go to city councils, which it's good that we go to city council meetings and stuff like that, and to vote for elected officials, but we need to somehow fill that gap as well of creating civic engagement. So I'd be interested
Yeah.
in like kind of your thought on that.
Let me give you another book. There's a book called Alienated America by Tim Carney, and I
Hmm.
interviewed him on my podcast a couple years ago when the book came out. And he looked at, and this will be interesting to you from being from Utah. He looked at the districts that Trump won in 2016 in the general election. So these were Trump districts, like they voted Republican, how they did in the Republican primaries. And what he was interested in is the dichotomy between the districts that basically voted not Trump in the primaries, but Trump in the general election.
Ah, yeah.
What is going on in these places? And what he found, and he went to a lot of these places, and then he also did some demographic research and what have you. And it parallels the bowling alone insights from Robert Putnam. What he found was that the places that did not vote for Trump have a high number of what I think you would just call like intermediating institutions. So
Hmm.
your existence is not you and the state. The relationship that you have is you, your church, your civic group, your school PTA, your softball league, all these institutions that kind of intermediate your life and your experience with other people. If you're playing together on a softball team, you don't really care about the politics of the people that you're playing with. You're there hanging out because you get to be friends in a non-political environment. Then when you wind up together at a school board meeting, you can actually chat about something because you have common ground. In places like this, what he found was that like if we just follow like the religious part, the number of people who identified as religious was actually lower than in the places that voted for Trump in the primaries. Those
Hmm.
places identified much more strongly as Christian predominantly, but religious. But church attendance in the non-Trump areas was way higher.
Interesting.
Um, there was very little church attendance in the other ones. What they found in the districts that went for Trump is that there was this feeling of isolation, of desperation, of being alone. You
Hmm.
had no intermediating institutions. You were, in a sense, isolated, and it was you and your television and the internet and the messages coming into you, but it was not you and your neighbors and your neighborhood and your organizations and your groups. It was you alone. And the thing about humans when they're alone is that they become very destructive to themselves. They become very destructive to themselves and to others. The way we make humans, I'm a huge introvert, but the way we make humans fully human is to get them interacting with other people. And I
Yeah.
find this myself. One of the things we've seen in this pandemic is that when you put people alone, they don't function well. They actually humans need human interaction with other people. And Zoom is not good enough. We have to actually see people and talk to them. And so the difference between the areas where you had a strong support for Trump and I think an agenda of and I say this as someone who did not vote for Donald Trump, but who has very close friends and people that I love and admire who did, a kind of politics of uh, resentment, anger, like the system needs to change, like and the Bernie people have that too to a degree. It's just
Sure.
focused differently, versus a politics of we have a community and a place, and that is working, and we just want to work to make it better. How do we make it better? And I do think that that reflects a lot on the suburban experiment. I mean, the suburban experiment is slash and burn agriculture as applied to urban spaces. And it does chew up places and spit them out and leave people isolated and desperate. And so while it's horrible for our finances, I think it's horrible for our places as well.
Yeah, yeah. This kind of gets to. I think this is referenced in Bowling Alone. There's kind of this de Tocqueville quote saying that like real American democracy happens in those. What did you call them? Kind of these
The
civic organizations.
intermediary institutions. Yeah, it's a bad phrase, but
But it's
you
like
know,
yeah, and you can make examples, and people are like, oh yeah, like this and that. What we don't realize is how atrophied these things have become. They used to be much bigger part of like the American life, and that was like really the first step of democracy is that you had all these places you could interact with other people, see them as human beings, and obviously there was overlaps too. So
right.
you'd be along to one club, and that overlapped with a sports group, and so there was just more of this thing of trust. So when you did all end up at city council meeting, you were like, oh, okay, he's disagreeing with me, but he brought me a casserole last week. So,
Yes.
you know,
Yes. Well, and I'm a Gen Xer, right?
yeah,
And the one like sociological critique of Gen, I mean, there's many, but the one that I think is appropriate of Gen X is that we don't join these things. I
yeah,
remember as a young professional, the boomers all wanting me to go join the Rotary Club and go join this, and I would go, and I'm like, this is a bunch of BS. Like, I don't like it here. I don't feel like I belong here. You know, you guys are just trying to get me to do the cleanup of the ditch thing because you don't want to do it anymore. You know, it seemed to me to be like fake and shallow. And that was my critique really of the boomers and of like the professional boomers, right? It was
yeah.
like, stay here and work your way up the ladder, the hierarchy of the organization. And Xers were just not raised that way. And so we tended to not join things. I think that that is a failing of my generation. But here's the crazy thing. We are way more joiners than the people coming after us.
Oh, really?
The millennials, the Z. Oh yeah, they'll join online groups and they'll chat that way. But like, go to Rotary meetings, go to civic organization, be part of a group that does. They'll organize at the local level spontaneously. I mean, you can put out a tweet and say we're going to do this cleanup, and a bunch of them will show up, and they're like, "Yeah, let's go." But in terms of like the things that need to happen to sustain in a de Tocqueville kind of way,
Hmm.
a broad civic infrastructure, this is a generation that is more isolated than any that has come before it
Hmm.
in that kind of way.
So that makes me. So my kind of question then is, and this gets back to you talking about the beehive, how the beehive like shapes what the bee is. And this is really what I've been interested in lately. And this kind of maybe brings it back a little bit to art, but really this can apply to anyone. The idea that the way we work, the work we do, we don't exist in a vacuum. That we have community, we have institutions around us, relationships, and that's kind of a container. That container like determines the possibility, not just the possibilities, but also like what's likely to happen, right? Because there's costs that like make things more preferable or not preferable, and the same thing is happening with like the urban form, like the suburban form, that it shapes possibilities and it shapes what's preferable. Um, so I guess the question is like this gets really to the way that Strong Towns functions. Where's the dial that we want to start turning? Do we start changing the form of the urban form, and that's going to help shape community and such? Or do we want to start connecting with others and use that dial to then start, you know, changing the urban form, opening up possibilities of what we can do as individuals, if that
Right.
makes sense.
It's a fascinating question, and I think in my ignorance, a decade ago, my default was we changed the city, right?
Mm,
And I say ignorance because that was what I knew and respected and understood and felt was possible. That was my professional realm. Um, yeah, today it's very clear. You start with people, right? Like we
mm,
we 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 will not change our cities overnight to be what they need to be. And particularly, I think it's important to understand that we're on this experiment. I mean, we threw out human habitat the way it evolved with us, and we said we're going to try something new. We're not going back to the way things were. Like we're down this route, you know. And if you want an analogy, if we start putting like computer chips in our brain and become like android cyborgs, you know, it may screw us up and we may become like really neurotic and depressed and all this, but it's not like we're going to take them out. I mean, you know, there's going to be some like
Yeah.
some interest or some advantage. You might have a sect over here, or over there who's like, I won't participate in brain augmentation, but you know, this is where we're at today. We are going to keep, we are not going to go back to what we had. We're going to evolve into something new, and we're going to do it with the starting conditions being where we're at right now. So the suburban experiment, this spread out development pattern, this insolvent from top to bottom governmental structure, that's our starting point. And so the question becomes one of how do we evolve that into something that, you know, makes us more fully human, that provides greater prosperity, greater human happiness, that puts us in a position where we can deal with stress and come out in an anti-fragile way, stronger and better on the other side. How do we evolve to that? And what I have come to recognize, or at least what I believe today, and looking back, recognize my ignorance of the past, is that it has to start with human relationships. It has to start with, we tell people who email us, you know, I'm fighting this project in my neighborhood and they're trying to build this highway or this interchange, or they're trying to do this thing. What do I do? And I'm like, have you met your neighbors? Like, do you know who they are? Do you know anything about them? Can you have them over for dinner and chat? Like, is that a natural thing for you? If you can't do that, there's nothing else you can do. Like nothing else you try to do is really going to be successful until you build a community of people that are going to work with you in this endeavor. And so we always say there's no lone wolves in strong towns. Like, you can't be a lone wolf. You have to find someone to commune with. And then the two of you have to find a way to work together, and then find a third and a fourth person. And you have to find a way to work together. This is why, you know, when you invited me to come on and said we want to talk about art, I do feel like there's a certain, my office right now today is in the Franklin Arts Center. This is a former junior high that has been turned into an artist studio place. And I'm lucky enough to have one of the studios here, but it's great. The people here are exciting. They're innovative. They have ideas. They're crazy. Most of their ideas are dumb and will never work, but some of them are awesome. And the thing is that they're very flexible thinkers. So when we start like talking about these problems, they'll throw out 20 ideas completely unashamed of doing it, knowing that like 18 of them are stupid and laughable. And like, everyone's like, this is really dumb. But 2 of them are going to be so genius and brilliant that we're all going to be like, wow, that's a great idea. Let's take it. I think we need more artists today than anything else, because engineers are never going to do this. Engineers would not throw out 20 ideas. They would throw out one idea that has backed up by, you know, 50,000 pages of research, is old and stagnant and been tried and failed 100 times. But, you know, you're not going to get accused of doing something crazy. We don't need that kind of mindset. We need the artist mindset out here, creating communities, driving innovation. And I think when I give advice to engineers, it's get out of the way of the artists. Like, follow them, let them go out and fix this stuff, and you just follow them and tidy it up a little bit.
Yeah, I've really been like struggling to try to like communicate to kind of my audience, which really comes from, I initially was doing these YouTube content, YouTube episodes, what do you call them, videos about here's how you make art. And I slowly been trying to incorporate more of this stuff, and I've been trying to like explain why this matters to artists. And what you said here, I think, is a really fantastic way to say it. I've been really interested in this idea of like serious play lately. You know, this idea that the problems we're facing in the world are so critical that we have to learn how to be creative to be able to address them. And yeah, maybe what you're saying here gets me excited because I want artists to think more about just themselves as a brand, or think about like how can I forward my career or become famous, and think about like how can you apply your creativity to like actually fix the world, you
Yeah.
know?
Well,
Um,
I can go to a neighborhood, and I have a lot of people to thank for this, but I think I'll point to Mike Lydon and also a guy named Edward Erfurt for giving me this sensibility. I remember the first time I went to New Orleans and I walked around with these guys, and they started showing me things that were sitting in plain sight that are basically like the markers of artists. Um, I grew up on a farm. I spent a lot of time in the woods growing up. We can walk around the woods and I can show you, look, there's deer that have been here. There's a bear that came through here. I can point out those things because I'm used to that habitat and I get it. I wasn't used to kind of in an urban space, places where artists were kind of coming in and being creative. And these guys started to point it out to me. And now I can go to a city and I can walk around in a neighborhood and you may say, maybe not you, but someone listening may say, well, this is kind of a poor rundown neighborhood. And I'll be like, yep, this neighborhood is struggling. And then we'll go to the next neighborhood and you'll say, well, this is a poor rundown neighborhood too. And I'm like, no, 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 no. This is a, this place is about to pop. Like this place is exciting. Like, look at this. And you'll see funky little art that people has put into things. They go out and hack stuff and make things like work a little bit better. They'll take, the little thing that is ugly and they'll do something to make it look better. And you just get this vibe in neighborhoods. Richard Florida wrote about this. And I think in some ways his findings have been caricatured as, just add artists and gay people and your place will be awesome. And I think it's really more subtle than that and really more nuanced than that. And if I put it in like the best framing, I would say, in order for our places to be successful, they need to unleash creative people to lead the way in that evolution and success. Because creative people, unlike me, who is kind of has this Spock like brain, like I'm an engineer, give me like the hyper rational, thing. The people who are artists tend to be connected to kind of the flow of people. And I don't mean flow as in like laminar flow, like flow through a pipe, like an engineer describes it, but I mean like the energy flow between two people and between people in a place, that emotional connection that kind of appeals to our insides, our heart and our instinct of what a place is. I think great artists are tied into that. And, another insight from Taleb is today artists, I do music. To me, you look today and like great artists, there's 100 of them and they got recording contracts and everybody knows them. Go back 100 years ago, there were 1 million artists. There were 20 million artists. They were in every church, every town hall, every city play. And it was amazing. And the distance between from music, the distance between someone who can't do music and someone who can do it at a neighborhood level is way, way greater than the distance between the person who can do it at the neighborhood level and the ultra professional, even though that distance is also huge, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like the distance between me and a great drummer, like a truly like amazing, astounding drummer is huge. Like I can't bridge that gap, but the distance between me and like someone who can't play drums at all is bigger than that even yet. So we have all these artists, not just in music, but in writing, in spoken word, in theater, in sculpture, in painting, in all these different realms. We have them that are 90% of the Beatles in our city, right?
yeah,
That like let's just like unleash that.
yeah.
Why would we stifle that, you know?
Yeah, and I really want to be generous with that definition of artist too. That I feel like that part of this is we've shaped our world in such a way that people feel they don't feel empowered to be artists in whatever way they can. But I love this idea that, I mean, our mindsets have been so wired to be like, I can only be a worthwhile artist if I am famous in some way. This idea of being, I think the idea of being a small fish or a big fish in a small pond is actually a lovely idea. The idea that we have like communities saturated with genius, and where we aren't trying to change the world, the whole world, but we're trying to change our world and use our genius to change like the world that matters to us. You know.
Right. I'm fortunate enough this summer I'm taking my kids to Rome. I have
Mm.
two daughters. They're 16 and 14. And I kind of penciled this trip in when the youngest one was born. Like when she gets 13, we're going to Rome. Well, we couldn't go when she was 13, but now we're going when she's 14. And you can, you can aspire to be Michelangelo and paint the Sistine Chapel. You can aspire to be Michelangelo and carve the Pieta and like, okay, this is immortal throughout all of history. But you can also walk around Rome's neighborhoods and just see the coming together of centuries of beautiful craftsmen who have built an amazing place that just improves people's lives to no end. And recognize that Michelangelo didn't start out as Michelangelo. Michelangelo is actually the culmination of many, many schools of artistry, all working in different realms in different ways and with different techniques that produced, a handful of artists that have endured over time. But none of that would be possible without all of this substructure of art that birthed that. And I think that's what we don't I think that's what we don't respect about evolution and about like organic systems. When we look at cities, we think cities are a collection of roads and streets and pipes and buildings and zoning classifications and financing schemes. And if we just put that in place, it will work. And that's treating it like a machine. Cities are this organic thing that emerges. And art is the same way. I mean, I think if we say, art is we will give you music lessons and then you will go and perform the song and now you're a musician.
Sometimes it
It's
doesn't work that way.
it does, but I don't
Well,
know
some people think
anyone.
about it that way. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. I don't know anyone who has become a successful musician following that path.
Yeah.
Successful musicians learn like here's an instrument, here's like the basics of the instrument, here's some classes to take, but here's four guys to jam with in their
Yeah.
garage. And here's like some people to go listen to in concert and see them do this stuff. And then here's someone who's going to teach you this like funky lick that you didn't know. And then you're going to learn this other thing over here from this completely other genre of music that you're going to incorporate in and like come up with something kind of new and funky. Most like rock music is three chords, but we have like an unlimited supply of music from three chords.
Yeah.
When you add a fourth chord or a diminished chord or something like this, you change everything. And I think that, if we respected Darwin's insights on evolution, we would be less hard on ourselves and recognize that your goal should not be to be Michelangelo, and like change all of human history and endure through all of time. Your goal should be, as part of this evolutionary process, to be part of the substructure that maybe will make you Michelangelo. Like maybe it will birth you as Michelangelo. But if you are just an artist in isolation from everybody else, you will never be a great artist.
Yeah.
Like you need that substructure, right? You need that. If you drop Michelangelo into, today, modernity today, you drop Mozart into modernity today, you drop Leonardo da Vinci or Shakespeare into modernity today, I don't think they become a fraction of what they became. And it's not because things don't scale. They scale even bigger than they did back then. But it's because they don't have the underlying like support framework of artistry
Yeah.
to kind of like shape them, mold them, influence them, inspire them to something else. We put people in isolation from each other and expect them to be creative, and that's not how creativity works.
Yeah, the thing that produced them, the community, the culture, the form of the urban form, that was all part of the masterpiece, right?
Yes,
That was the
yes.
masterpiece that then And that's what excites me, is the idea of how do we create places that are artworks themselves. And
Yeah.
I don't think we have to worry so much about, I have to create some sort of brilliant masterpiece. As long we can live in places, if we focus on that first, that stuff's going to merge naturally. Um, I
Well,
really,
Malcolm Gladwell did this series on early versus late bloomers. And he
mm,
talks about Picasso as being like an early bloomer. Picasso, someone who just saw like he just saw things differently. But he was also connected to this community of cubists and people who were doing this kind of work, and he was deeply influenced by them. But he also, at age 17 and 18 was doing these mind-blowing things because he just saw things differently. But most artists, or a high percentage of artists, are late bloomers. They're people who have some inspiration and they work on things. And if you go back, and I think it was Cezanne he focused on in this series, but he's like, Cezanne would do like the same painting 50 times, and he would destroy the first 49 because they weren't they weren't exactly the way he wanted it, and he would work over and over and over to get it right. Both, again, not in isolation. And Cezanne was like picking up different techniques and different ways of looking at things and representing things from people along the way. He stole like an artist, right? The book.
yeah,
I think that if you look at those examples, I think people think that they should be Picasso, not recognizing that Picasso also did not come from isolation,
yeah,
right? But the reality is that most of us are Cezanne, and most of us can get to a place of doing amazing, beautiful artistry if we embrace the community, the human habitat,
yeah.
all the things that go along with it that mold and shape us.
I like this change. It's a really it's a change in paradigm from what do I need to do to who do I need to connect with.
Commune with, I was going to say. Yeah.
Commune is nice. It makes me think of, there's the biblical line. I'm going to slaughter it, but it's like, when two or three are gathered in my name, there I am.
Right.
And there's a real magic that happens as soon as two people share a viewpoint of the world. It becomes reality. It changes your way of seeing things. And one thing I hear a lot is there's this phrase like, find the others. Like, once you can actually connect to someone that can share kind of a vision, I mean, that's kind of the biggest first. I mean, going to 3 or 4 or 5, I think, is easier after you can get kind of that first person to connect
Yes.
with, right?
Well, you mentioned very early on in our conversation today, you mentioned the book Suburban Nation, and you mentioned Walkable Cities.
Yeah.
Both of them were written by Jeff Speck. Suburban
Mm-hmm.
Nation was also written by Andres Duany and Liz Plater-Zyberg. They wrote those books, and I read them. I mean, I thought, I read Suburban Nation in 2004 or 5 or something like that, when close to when it came out. These were massively influential to me. I listened to, on YouTube, Andres Duany giving speeches, and I thought, this is really influential to me. But I tell you, when everything changed, when I went to CNU and I sat in a room and I chatted with him, and when I went and got invited to go to a house in New Orleans back in like 2010 or something like that, and sit with like 20 young new urbanists and talk about things. And then Andres came and hung out with us for an afternoon, and we just chatted about ideas. And I went home, and it was just this explosion of creativity. I had read everything. I had watched everything. I had immersed myself in it, but it was only when I had those human reactions and connections that really, like, the stuff of Strong Towns started to come forth. Strong Towns is an offshoot of New Urbanism. I mean, I've said that in other places. It's not that we like take marching orders from the New Urbanists. We don't. But if I were to say, like, where does the creativity part of this come from? New Urbanism has been the accelerator of all of it. And it's been those personal connections that has, I mean, I still, one of the guys who texts me every day is a guy I met in 2010 in New Urbanism. And he'll send me like, hey, check this out, or think about this, or I read your article today and I think you maybe missed this thing. This is my group.
Yeah. That's pretty powerful. So, anyway, that's a good way to probably wrap things up. I had some other questions, but I feel like they're just like too technical and just get away from the spirit of like of where this is right now. So I don't know if you have some kind of final things you want to say, or I always like to give the last word, and yeah, maybe.
No, I feel like we recommended some really good books here.
Yeah.
And I feel like we give people a lot to think about. Um, Strong Towns is this kind of ever evolving movement, and the thing that we're trying to do this year, we're calling 2020 the year of action.
Mm,
So what we are really focusing on is trying to distill down Strong Towns thoughts to the first action people can take.
mm,
So I am hearing Strong Towns for the first time. I'm really interested in this. What can I do? And a lot of the answer to that question depends on who you are and where you are, and but we've created this thing called the Action Lab. We created this thing called the Strong Towns Academy. We're trying to put out there into the marketplace of ideas the next step for people to take, because what we really need now in 2021 more than anything is for people to go do it, like stop waiting for others to solve these things
yeah.
and take ownership of it. And you misquoted Christian doctrine. Actually, you did a really good job of it.
I'm sure it's
I'm gonna,
close.
yeah, you're close. I'm gonna print off this quote because I wind up using it so much and it's wrong. But I'm gonna misquote Judaism. There's a Jewish like proverb or saying about the struggles of society, and it goes something along the lines of, these are not your problems to fix. You look out over all the challenges and all the things that we're dealing with, and whether you tune into Fox News or MSNBC and you're rattled by the state of the world and the state of all this stuff, these are not your problems to fix, but neither are they something you can desist from working on. It
Mm,
is your responsibility to work on it with what you have. And so I think this idea of the problems are so huge, the only thing I can do is like support other people doing that. No, the
yeah.
problems are so huge, and so everybody has a responsibility to go out and do what they can. And
Yeah.
that's the way we end our podcast: is do what you can to build a strong town. Take what you have, the resources and capabilities you have, and try to make things a little bit better where you are today. That's all of our responsibilities.
Awesome. Well, that is a fantastic way to wrap things up. So, Chuck, this is like absolute pleasure. Thanks again for joining me here, and it was a really fun conversation, energizing, made me excited to go out and start doing stuff. All
Thanks, Brandon. It's great to
right.
talk to you. Let's keep in touch.
All right, will do. You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.